Uh,
Sorry, Karen.
no worries, no worries. I don't know if you wanted to say a few words, Cody. Cody's the hardest working person at Neurologics. He's done all the things and all the jobs, and he runs our webinars. So I depend heavily upon him. And I don't know if you wanted to kick it off, Cody, or if you just
Sure,
wanted to.
yeah.
Yeah,
Well, first, I'll just say, yeah, thank you to Karen. We'll have Dr. Peter Mikulecky joining us here shortly. And Thank you for joining this webinar series. If you get questions along the way, feel free to drop them in the chat, or you'll be invited to unmute yourself at the end to ask in person for a little Q&A. But we're all very excited because this is our 15th year at Neurologics, and we hope you enjoy this presentation, and I'll hand it off to you, Karen.
sure. So for those of you who don't know me or who haven't watched a lot of the YouTube content or looked at our webinar, I'm someone who learns differently. I was diagnosed with profound learning disability, and they called it that in the last semester of graduate school. And quite honestly, I laughed and thought, not me. I'm the smart girl. I'm the girl who was in the gifted program. I You're certainly wrong. This can't be correct. And as it turned out, after taking a number of testing instruments, my graduate school professor turned to me and said, "You have a profound learning disability." And so for me, hearing that I was disabled in some way, despite the fact that I had been successful, was really unique and also disconcerting. And so I would describe myself as high academically performing. And I didn't realize all the workarounds that I had to put in place and the stress that put on my brain until much later. Today, we're going to talk about how to be best in class, how to use our peak performance academic tools to reduce the difference between top line IQ and default in stress. And we'll explain what that is in a minute. Um, I'm really pleased to be joined by Dr. Peter Mikulecky. We call him Dr. Mick. Dr. Mick is the author of many of the books for dummies, the science and math driven books that are called For Dummies. And certainly, science and math were one of my great challenges when I was in both, you know, high school, undergrad, business school, the London School of Economics, all of those things. Math was really difficult for me and challenging. In this webinar, you'll learn how to help your students um, sur- surpass some of those challenges and thrive, not just survive academically. Next slide, Cody. I love this. This is a quote from NIH. The human brain is the most complicated biological structure in the known universe. We've just scratched the surface in understanding how it works. Next slide. Neurologics has unlocked the brain. One slide back, Cody. Thank you so much. Um, that's a pretty profound thing in understanding our brains are what make us human. They're what make us unique. While we could all agree that our hearts look similar, our livers look similar, our kidneys look similar, how our brains function, the very uniqueness of our core being lives in our brain. And so that makes it our most important organ. Understanding stress in students. Stress is defined as the body's natural response to challenges or demands. For students, stress arises from academic pressure like exams, assignments, and the need to achieve high grades. We certainly can agree that in today's competitive collegiate environment, stress for students is even more profound and demanding than it was when we were in school. Some examples that are specific to student life are academic pressure, social pressure, and future uncertainty. We also call future uncertainty anticipatory anxiety. And you can see on the graphic on the right just how prevalent academic stress is and what the sources of student pressure look like and are. I think adding to this, most of us as parents can agree that we didn't have the stress of managing social media or managing things like process addiction and content and screens as it related to school and academic performance. We didn't have this as a challenge or something that we needed to regulate or modulate. It was something brand new for this generation of students. Next slide. Other factors affecting brain health. Cognitive impairment, lack of sleep is a big one. And the challenges of academic performance, I am certainly not alone when I come downstairs for a drink of water, sometimes at midnight or 1 o'clock in the morning, and find my senior in high school downstairs in the kitchen studying. And while I've been in bed for hours, he certainly hasn't. And some of the self-imposed academic stress is different than our generation as well. The ability to emotionally regulate, sleep deprivation can heighten emotional reactivity, which makes students more prone to things like stress, anxiety, and depression. So sleep's a big one. Poor nutrition. Diets that are high in sugar and unhealthy fat can also impair brain function, while nutrients like omega-3 fatty acids, fish oil, vitamins, and minerals are critical for maintaining brain health. Nutrition also impacts memory and concentration, and it can lead to deficiencies in essential nutrients, which negatively impacts memory, concentration, and cognitive performance. And then the lack of physical activity. So these are the big three: sleep, poor nutrition, and lack of physical activity. So the three takeaways that would improve stress management for your student are these three. The physical inactivity is linked to reduced cognitive function and an increased risk of mental health issues like depression. Brain plasticity. Exercise promotes brain plasticity, which is essential for learning and memory. Next slide, please. IQ as it relates to stress. This was a new concept for me 15 years ago. I knew about IQ, which is measurement of how we learn. And I knew that overall IQ is measured in a typical IQ test. But I didn't understand that that's a best case scenario measurement of the brain's ability to think. And what that means is it's indicative of the brain's ability to think in a perfect environment. And what that means is it's temperature controlled, it's quiet, there's no ambient noise. It's a typical test-taking environment where it is silent with no interruption or intrusion. And you also aren't managing or multitasking. You're focusing only on the task at hand, which is paper instrument testing. Functional IQ measures the brain's ability to think under stress while performing real tasks. And so the example I like to give is it's far different measuring the brain's ability to think and react if you're driving down the 405, for those of us who live in California, and perhaps you have a dog in your back seat, and that dog just threw up on the carpet, and maybe you have a toddler who's throwing Cheerios into the front seat, and you're in a traffic jam and recognize that you're going to be 30 minutes late at your destination. Your IQ, your big brain IQ, is the top line IQ, and that's the number that looks at learning in a perfect environment. The more real life measurement is that bottom IQ. The IQ under stress is much more accurate and reflective of how you function in everyday life. And it is the distance between these two numbers that we're most concerned about. So it's pretty normal to have a standard deviation, 10 points, between your perfect top line IQ and your bottom line IQ. Even 1.5 standard deviations, 15 points, still wouldn't be seen as out of the ordinary. But when, for example, a normal IQ is 100, if you drop 20 points and you drop to 80, if you have a normal IQ of 100 and you drop to 80, 80 is the standard that the government decides is impaired and worthy of compensation for being not able to work or function or be vocationally trained. So the distance between top and bottom really does matter. If you have a gifted IQ and you're in that, let's say you're in that 120 or 125 range and you drop 20 points, then you just drop to a normal IQ. And being asked to do gifted work while you are only functioning with a normal IQ creates a lot of extra stress on your brain. Neurologics optimization builds brain resiliency. so that functional IQs stay higher, often much higher. And neurologic brain maps highlight the brain issues that cause those functional IQs to drop. Next slide, please. Working memory. There's more than one kind of memory, and this was a new concept for me 15 years ago as well. When I discovered this technology, kind of quite by accident, and I say there are no accidents in life, I didn't really understand what working memory did or how it functioned. Um, there's more than one kind of memory. The more we learn about the brain, the more sophisticated our models and memory grow. You might be familiar with the difference between long-term memory and short-term memory, for example. But working memory is what's key. Working memory is like the workspace where your brain holds all the pieces that are relevant to the task at hand. And working memory helps with performing those tasks, achieving those goals, and making decisions. Working memory also helps us react to new information, and it also helps us focus on what's most important, filtering out distractions. Neurologic brain maps reveal brain issues that impair our working memory, and our optimization builds capacity in working memory. The bottom line is that neurologics helps us focus, react, and help make quick decisions. Next slide. I like to talk about mental health and behavioral health as an iceberg. I'm a clinician, I'm an adolescent and young adult therapist. And in my training in grad school and my postgraduate training, we're trained to look at what's above the waterline and point at that thing and call it a label. And we use this to communicate with educators, other clinicians, parents, and with other professionals, and sometimes even with the child or the adolescent or the young adult being labeled. And so there's something called the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. And what we do above the waterline is point at symptom clusters and call in standardized testing, in psych testing, in educational testing. We look also above the waterline and we look at symptoms, histories, and standardized testing scores. And we just look at what's above the water and imagine that that's the complete picture. But if you look at brain mapping or you look at more technologic advances in behavioral science and behavioral medicine, you're looking actually at what's underneath the waterline. And you can see that that is a much, much larger body of work. It looks at real-time brain activity, and it looks at connectomics, which is how the brain communicates with itself, with the other parts of the brain. And it looks at what's under the waterline causing the things that we label, and those are called root causes. And then it does an analysis through neuroengineering, and it looks at the entirety of what's underneath the waterline instead of just what's above the waterline to give us the whole picture. I'm going to ask if Dr. Mick has joined us yet. Are you here, Peter?
I'm here.
You're here. Okay. The next slide, I'm going to turn this over to Dr. Mick, who is amazing at being able to talk about things like the effects of stress on brain health, the parts of the brain, the function of the brain, and how neuroengineering and neurooptimization impacts that.
Thank you. So we're going below the waterline a little bit here. When we talk about the effects of stress on brain function, the classical picture, or how we think about that in terms of the anatomy of the brain, has to do with three main portions of the brain: the hippocampus, the prefrontal cortex, and the amygdala. So the hippocampus and the amygdala would be, if we pulled this flap that you see here that I'm circling, if we pulled that away from the brain, it would reveal a pocket. And in that pocket, we would find the hippocampus and the amygdala. And then the prefrontal cortex is the portion near the front that we sort of are used to associating with higher level thought and our sense of self. And it's usually these are the three parts of the brain that light up and images where they're looking for the effects of stress on the brain. And that's basically still a relevant picture. But the picture has evolved in a couple of ways. One way is that we don't really think of each of these three parts of the brain, the hippocampus, which has a lot of associations with learning and memory, the prefrontal cortex, which has associations with decision making and problem solving, and the amygdala, which is all tied into emotions, particularly fear and anxiety. The old way of thinking about it is that each of these regions of the brain does sort of that defined job in isolation, right? Where we think of a region of a brain as having a specific job, and that's all it does. One way that picture has changed as we learn more about the brain is that we realize that it's always the case that all of these structures are constantly communicating with one another. They're having conversations in time, and and it's not just these three structures, but it's really a conversation that involves the many regions of the distributed over the entire brain, and the brain also having discussions with our hormones and the rest of our body. So it's a big network, and stress has major impacts on the functioning of that network in ways that we can see clearly in the hippocampus, prefrontal cortex, and amygdala, but for which those three areas are just hubs as opposed to sole players. The other big change in how we think about how stress affects brain health has to do with neurotransmitters, especially serotonin and dopamine. And the way to think about any neurotransmitter, but particularly these two, is if structures like the hippocampus, prefrontal cortex, and amygdala are individual nodes or positions that are linked together and they communicate over those links, we can think of neurotransmitters as being more spread out, diffuse kinds of signals that regulate how effective the communication over those links is. So the structures on top make sort of the overall network, and then the neurotransmitters fine tune how communication actually flows over that network. And we just, brain science has learned a whole lot about how the complex dynamics that play out as all these things exert their effects in real time. And this is the point of all this, is that this is the level at which we're doing that below the water analysis. And we're tying patterns at this level to the above the water metrics that we still use. They still have great value, but we need to connect those above the water metrics to the below the water engineering, the information plumbing of the brain, which is what these are about. And we can go to the next slide. So one of the main tools that we use to peer below the water is the brain map. It's where we get our first glimpse, a baseline of how that brain is functioning in real time. And so it's a way to visualize the activity of different parts of the brain. There are many kinds of brain maps that visualize different aspects of the brain. One way that we use at Neurologics is that we look at the electrical activity of the brain. When brain cells communicate with other brain cells, it's essentially through electricity, sending electricity over connections. And those signals create fields that we can measure outside of the skull. And so as different parts of the brain become more and less active, we can measure those increases and decreases in activity. Other kinds of brain maps measure blood flow. So for example, MRI scans that a lot of us are probably familiar with are measuring blood flow and using that as a way to estimate the activity of different parts of the brain. There are other methods that this PET and SPECT imaging, they use radioactive chemicals that must be injected and then taken up into the brain. And then as the different parts of the brain become more active, the cells in the brain uh, metabolize those radioactive compounds, and that's the signal that they're measuring. Um, there is another kind of use of electrical activity that people often confuse with what we do at Neurologics. At Neurologics, the method that we use is called QEEG. Um, it's reading essentially those electrical signals. We call them brain waves. There's an older technology called neurofeedback that also reads electrical activity, reads EEG signals. And so there's a part of the technology that drives neurofeedback that we also use in QEEG, but they're really two distinct technologies because in neurofeedback, they're typically measuring signals from a small collection of positions on the brain, just one or two positions usually. And they don't do very much with the data. Mostly they're just measuring, does it go up, does it go down, and doing a few calculations. And it gives you just a kind of a very narrow view of one particular aspect of brain activity. In QEEG is basically what happened when neurofeedback got paired up with big data and fast computers that started becoming available in the 90s and 2000s. And so in QEEG, we are simultaneously measuring activity across the entire outside of the brain. And we're also able to calculate what's happening in many regions inside the brain. We're measuring all of the activity thousands of times a second. And then the big difference is we do a lot with that data, right? We analyze the data to get a picture of how information is flowing across all these different parts of the brain. And most importantly, where it's not flowing as efficiently as it could. And our brain map is a map in the sense that it shows us where are the traffic jams in information in the brain. And what optimization does, which is what follows after brain mapping, is we again use EEG to build customized programs to open up those traffic jams and allow information to flow efficiently in the regions where it wasn't. And the end result is improved brain function, which we can measure above the waterline with some of those more traditional measures. So some big distinctions between our Neurologics QEEG brain maps and these other brain map technologies that you might be familiar with is the safety. We're not putting anything into the brain. We're only measuring the natural electrical activity that occurs in anybody's brain as they think. It's convenient because the equipment that's necessary to do this kind of brain map is portable. We can bring it to individual people in their homes or offices or schools or whatever programs they're involved in. It's not a huge room-filling scary machine that like you would see with an MRI or a CT scan. It's fast. We can measure the changes in brain activity from 1,000th of a second to the next. And that's very, very different than CT scans or MRI scans or PET scans. These kinds of scans, although they're great for certain things, they're only measuring changes in activity over a few seconds to, in some cases, even a minute or two. And that's just super, super slow compared to the rate that the brain operates at. And so there's a lot you simply cannot see with a slower imaging technology. And then there's just the richness of the data that we collect. We're covering the entire outside of the brain, many regions inside the brain, thousands of times a second, and watching changes in activity as people do real tasks that cause their brain to, we're putting the brain through its paces. So we can go to the next slide. Okay, because we're measuring so much information as it changes in time, we can see patterns of change over time. And this is really something that only our technology can do, which is to visualize the waves of activity that travel over the brain. We're not just measuring between 2 points, is there more or less communication? We're seeing entire wave-like patterns of information flow over different regions of the brain. And these patterns can occur more efficiently or less efficiently. And that's what we're zeroing in on. And that's what tells us how to build a customized program for each individual person's brain to help them improve their function. You can go to the next slide. Yeah.
The two services of neurologics, I'll take this one, Peter. So we really do two different things. As Peter explained, we do brain mapping, and we have the most state-of-the-art brain map available to make what he so kindly broke down in scientific form really simple. Our brain map looks at the brain as it's thinking at the speed of thought, which is different than looking at the brain at rest. And the information that you can get from the brain as it's thinking is vastly different than when you're not asking the brain to perform a task. Our brain maps are capable of analyzing over 12,000 domains of brain function, which provides us with vital metrics for clinical insight. And so that's the under the waterline iceberg information from the previous slide. That is amazingly cool in and of itself, to be able to look at your brain and be able to pinpoint exactly how does it function, where is it functioning well, what are the portions of the brain that aren't functioning so well and could use some help. Just that in and of itself is valuable, but it's married to something called optimization. And that is also something that Peter was referencing, which is a cognitive rehabilitation training tool, which we call neuroengineering. And that is guided by a brain-computer interface as well as a live coach. And so if you think about going to the gym with a personal trainer, this is having a personal trainer for your brain. And the computer equipment is similar to the gym equipment in that while you need to utilize that, we all know that if I have an appointment at 6 o'clock with a trainer at the gym, I'm much more likely to get there than if I know that I can go anytime throughout the day, but I don't have necessarily an appointment or some accountability. Every brain map is different. My brain map doesn't look like Peter's brain map, doesn't look like the man in this photo is a professional hockey player. His brain map doesn't look like mine. The brain map informs the optimization process, and that optimization process restores the brain to peak cognitive function in 4 to 6 months on average. And that's with 50-minute appointments 3 times a week. So just like going to the gym 3 times a week for 50 minutes, this is going to the brain gym with a trainer 3 times a week. And the cognitive repair becomes permanent in 4 to 6 months. And that is through a process called synaptogenesis. Next slide. Optimization for peak performance significantly improves memory and functional IQ and IQ under stress. For me, as a therapist who's not a scientist, I'm not a neuroscientist, the most profound thing was permanent increase in IQ of at least 15 points. And this is over 23,000 brain maps. So it's not a small number. It's a large number of clients that we've treated. And so for every one of those to have at least an increase of 15 permanent IQ points, for me, it's valuable to break down what does that mean, like we talked about before. So if you are someone with an IQ of 100 and you gain 15 to 18 functional IQ points permanently, that takes you into a college level IQ. If you are in a college level IQ, 15 to 18 point bump permanently takes you to a graduate school IQ. The stress default performance is the piece that we're so interested in as well, because again, how you learn in a perfect environment, while that's helpful to know, we don't live in a perfect environment. We live in the actual world. The other thing that was profoundly impactful for myself personally when I went through this process was the increase in memory. The average recall increase of 49% for any student makes life so much easier than being able to try to recall information and just having it not be there for me, in graduate school, I recognized that the workaround was cramming for tests and being able to perform for the test, but not necessarily prior to optimization, be able to hang on to the information and use it in my actual life. So I would equate it to putting information on a whiteboard and writing those pieces of information as tiny as I could on a whiteboard, and then being able to regurgitate that whiteboard in order to be able to perform on the test. And then because my brain was so stressed at that point, it would be as though the whiteboard became erased to make room for new information, but I wouldn't have the ability to recall it or use it in daily life. Next slide, please. This is a Peter slide. Peter, this is what we call one of our reports of findings, and Dr. Mick is one of the clinicians who goes through the report of findings and explains it, and he'll do that for you now.
So what we're looking at here is one specific part of a report of findings in which we have long lists of potential symptoms or issues that someone might experience, and each issue has a checkbox, and there's either a check or there isn't a check. And what determines whether there's a check in each of those boxes is a mathematical analysis of their brainwaves. So we have the benefit, since we've been doing this for so many years, and I've looked at so many tens of thousands of brains, of having a very massive database of brains that we can associate with issues. And so we know what the patterns look like that go with, for example, emotional dysregulation or anxiety, or even something as abstract seeming as immature behavior. We know what patterns tend to associate with those symptoms. And so each brain map includes this section where we get a profile of likely issues or symptoms that someone may be experiencing. And this is very useful and often validating for people who've gotten brain mapped to see that something as objective as a mathematical analysis of their brain waves can paint a picture of what it's like to move through their days that is recognizable to them. And that for some people, we'll hear them say, oh, I haven't been just making up a story, that there is something happening here. And the point that I will often make in return is absolutely. And what's great is that if we can see it and measure it reliably, we can do something about it. Because the very patterns that we're analyzing to produce these checked boxes are the patterns that we can target in an optimization. And so it is typically the case that as someone proceeds through optimization and their brain is essentially becoming more efficient, these check marks tend to fall away, and people tend to self-report that they are no longer feeling as anxious, or that they can think more clearly when they're at school, and things of that nature. So it's nice to be able to convert the data into something that's relatable and that people can understand in terms of what it's like to be them from day to day. We can go to the next slide. One of the things that I really appreciate and that makes the report of findings meetings with our clients so useful is that we bring together that under the water level of analysis with the above the water level of analysis. So in addition to measuring brain connections and efficiencies and all of that, we can also produce those symptom checkboxes, which I already mentioned, but also we collect scores on more traditional cognitive or neuropsych type testing that might be similar to some testing that people have had before they even found neurologics. And the idea is, if we know what we're doing well enough, and if optimization proceeds as it's supposed to, then as communication through the brain circuits improves, which is what we're directly influencing, we should see corresponding improvements in all sorts of various measurements of cognitive function, things like what's listed in this chart: fluid reasoning, thinking efficiency, processing speed. And so each report of findings includes not just the visual inspection of what's happening with the efficiency of communication over circuits, but we're also looking at actual objective improvements over time in all of these various cognitive psychology metrics. And at this point, I will often interpret the changes that we see in terms of what I call a pyramid of cognition, where things like IQ sit at the top of the pyramid, but any IQ that our brain might be supporting itself rests on the next layer of the pyramid, which is a little bit wider. So IQ rests on top of things like processing speed and thinking efficiency. But that layer, because it's a pyramid, in turn relies on more foundational layers, things like attention and focus, which these bottom areas are measuring, and things like working memory, which sits at the base. And so if we go to the next slide, this is a before and after picture that focuses on working memory and things like information retention and learning ability that working memory directly supports. And you can see in this case, and this is reasonably typical of what we see for many, many clients, this person's auditory and visual working memory was in the marginally in the typical range. This is about as low as you can get and still be considered typical, but they weren't outside the typical range. But even because working memory is so foundational, even that slight depression in those areas had major impacts on their ability to retain information and to learn. And there were similar small deviations from typical in their short-term memory. After 4 months of optimization, the working memory and short-term memory was at or slightly above typical. And what's always fun to see and happens really almost every time is that small, 10 to 15 point improvements in working memory and short-term memory result in huge improvements in information retention and learning ability, which are high level improvements that are going to transfer to all sorts of domains of real life experience. And these are the kinds of changes that go hand in hand with people actually telling us that they notice a difference. And it's very reliable that when certain scores like working memory go up, scores that are higher on the pyramid rise with them. Next slide. This is again before and after. Now we're looking at different measurements of executive processing. So these are the school and work type thinking functions that we're measuring here. So the ability to stay organized and make a plan and follow through and maintain focus on information we're trying to follow. And we can see here, this person, these are also very representative of what we often see. Here's a person who had a very high fluid reasoning, more than a full standard deviation above typical. And fluid reasoning is a great marker for us because it basically tells us what's in there, it sets the bar for where some of these other scores should be. And I will point that out to people, many people who've got maybe they've evolved a low estimation of their own ability over time, but we can point out, hey, your fluid reasoning is way above typical. There's a very good chance that this fluid reasoning is the level at which you probably could be operating. And then over time, as we do optimization, what we see is often a pattern just like this, where there'll be some moderate but important improvements in attention and focus, which is what we see at the bottom that were in red before and are now sort of now breaking the threshold and towards the typical region after optimization. Those improvements in attention and focus then tend to have improvements in processing speed and thinking efficiency, which is what we see here. And when processing speed and thinking efficiency go up, then everything that's higher on the pyramid than those two goes up as well. And so what we see at the end is that the highest level measurements, the ones that we notice in day-to-day life, like IQ, thinking ability, thinking efficiency, they are now in the same neighborhood as the fluid reasoning. Um, this person actually even got a bump in their fluid reasoning, which that doesn't always happen. But what almost always happens is that wherever the fluid reasoning was, we're able to bring those high level metrics into the same neighborhood, and that makes a real difference in their lives. Next slide. So I think probably hand it back
Sure,
to you.
I'll take it. So high performers, what does this do for a student? First of all, how you perform academically often has so much to do with your worldview and how you think of yourself, your self-concept. So one of the things Dr. Mick is fabulous at is being able to show kids what's possible from their first brain map forward. There are kids who say, I don't have grades for that, or I'm not bright enough to do that, or I can't do college. Or there are kids who have such anticipatory anxiety about a four-year college that perhaps they go to a two-year college. They alter their academic course based on what they think they can do, and based upon their ability or inability to manage stress. So what does Neurologics do to help students? For the high-performing student who's already incredibly high-performing, we've treated Olympians, we've treated kids in private schools across America who are destined for Ivy League schools. We optimize brain function for peak performance. For the undiagnosed and misdiagnosed, that was me. I was undiagnosed, and in fact, when my grad school professor said, this had to be picked up in kindergarten and I'll give you extra credit, and not require you to take the final exam if you figure this out, she called my attention to the relationship between my high IQ, my ability to learn, and this profound learning disability that I had. I like to speak of learning disabilities as learning differences, and parents and educators ask me, well, what is the difference? And I say, there is no difference, but I would certainly rather have a learning difference than a disability. No one wants to be disabled. For all students, brain maps and individual optimization provides permanent cognitive improvement. And so what does that mean? It's very, very different than neurofeedback, which is symptom reduction. And in saying, well, hey, how is this different for my student than symptom reduction? I would say symptom reduction has its value. And I would say when I have a headache, I am very, very grateful to be able to take a Tylenol and reduce my symptoms. However, that Tylenol is not going to look at why did I have the headache? What is the root cause of my headache? And how do we get to that root cause? That is the difference between us and other technologies. Next slide. School and Neurologics, it's this different tools and the same goal. We interface and interact with private schools and alternative schools with regularity. And we think of ourselves as, if you're building a house, we're the brain function, we are the concrete. The school or the program or the learning environment is the frame. And so if you think about, living in a house, you can't live on concrete. The ability for school to be related to Neurologics, certainly we work also in therapeutic boarding school environments, and where we actually plug in and Neurologics becomes part of that student's day. And so the process of that, we have different tools, but the same goal, and that's to teach and motivate students. And boy, if you have a brain that's optimally performing, you sure can take advantage of all of the wonderful things that different schools and learning environments have to offer. This is the process, the Neurologics process. And first we brain map, that's a 2-hour process. Then there's a report of findings. We call that the ROF. And that's a detailed report of what the brain map provides. That's about 10 pages in length. You also get a conference with Dr. Mick or one of our other providers, wherein that detailed report of findings is gone over in a 30-minute consultative review. Then a customized treatment protocol is put together, and that's a process of neuroengineering. Those are exercises to target specific brain networks, and those result in improved performance. So every other month, we do another brain map, and that is a repetitive process where we do a map. Then we do 24 sessions of neuroengineering. And then we, once there is improved performance, we do another map and compare that to the first. And then we alter the neuroengineering process based on the gains that have been made. And we go through this cycle in a 4-month process. There are a minimum of 3 brain maps: the first brain map, the baseline, the midpoint brain map, and the endpoint brain map. And for every additional 2 months, there is an additional brain map. Next slide. Why get a brain map? It's important to know how stress affects your child's brain and also what can be done about it. And that is the difference between top line IQ and default stress IQ. And we all at Neurologics have heard the stories over and over and over from parents and educators, especially from parents, where they say, look, my kid is bright. I know they're bright. They have an IQ of this, and yet they have difficulty performing, or yet they stress out incredibly, or they have so much anticipatory anxiety they can't go to school. It's important to know how stress affects your child's brain and what can be done. It also can detect hidden dangers like damage from toxins, head injuries, and trauma. The longer you wait to act, the more your child's brain may develop suboptimally, and that's when it has an impact on their overall self-concept or self-esteem. Next slide. And as our gift for attending this webinar, if you contact Michelle in admissions by Friday, we'd like to give you a $500 gift card towards the Neurologics brain map. And now if there are any questions, Cody will field those for Dr. Mick and I.
Well, one question we get is about the age range of students that we can service, and then also where we're able to service clients.
Those are great questions. We map children as young as kindergarten age, and we have mapped older adults in their 80s, so who call themselves students of life, people who have experienced cognitive decline and just want their brains to be better. So if we like to have children as early as possible, because there's a brain process called pruning that takes place 3 times in life, and we the earlier the better. So we love to get kindergarten, school-age children ages 5 or 6. We map people as old as 80. We map in all of the 48, lower 48 states without the need to travel. And we have Neurologics brain mappers who do the traveling for you. So wherever you are in the lower 48, we do not ask you to travel to one of our assessment centers. If you are in Alaska or Hawaii, we ask you to come to our Neurologics Newport Assessment Center, which is right in the heart of Newport Beach, across the street from Fashion Island. So those are great questions.
And another one we got was, we talked a little bit about peak performance, but other use cases for this technology, anything else that might be hindering the brain? Absolutely.
We're really well known for our work with traumatic brain injury, and we're peer reviewed in that vertical. That would be anybody who's experienced, not just a sports related injury, although there are 23 different kinds of concussion sports. It could be somebody who, just as simple as fell out of their high chair as a toddler, took a fall and hit their head on the concrete as a child, fell out of a swing, was hit with a baseball. There are so many different ways that people become impaired through traumatic brain injury that they may not recollect or recall. And so using a brain map to rule in or rule out TBI, traumatic brain injury, is incredibly helpful. And that's actually the easiest population that we treat. We treat kids and adults with attentional difference. What does that mean? Not just ADHD. And if you think about ADHD, often it's a mistake to think about just one or other of the forms of ADHD with or without hyperactivity. There are actually 23 different forms of attentional difference and 11 mimics. And so knowing which of those you have and how that can be optimized in a drug-free way is helpful. We have lots of parents who are reluctant to put their child on a stimulant that is a controlled substance. And so Neurologics is an alternative to analyzing the attentional difference and then optimizing the attentional difference. kids with learning differences of all kinds, whether that's just an attentional difference or some other impediment to academic function. We also work with people with all forms of addiction, whether that is a process addiction to a device, whether that is online gaming, whether that is substance use disorder. We work with people with all kinds of labels, anybody who would like their brain to function or improve their brain function, that's a Neurologics client.
Great. I don't think there's any more questions unless anybody else has anything that they'd like to ask before we wrap up. No?
Okay.
Well, then this webinar will be available on our YouTube channel. It's youtube.com/neurologics. And we look forward to seeing you at the next one.
Thank you guys so much for spending your lunchtime with us.